Hello, everyone. We're going to jump into Unit 4 now, and we're going to talk about cash management topics. So the first thing we're going to talk about on this topic is budgeting. A lot of times when you're talking to financial planners and they start talking about budgeting, a common phrase that they use is spending plan. So if we say budgeting or spending plan, we use those terms interchangeably, but both of them represent a forward-looking version of the income statement. So if you recall, the income statement is backward-looking and looks at clients' income and expenses over some past period of time. Well, a budget or spending plan is going to have income and expenses, but these are going to be projected looking into the future. So let's look at some different things that we might consider when working with a client on cash management from a budgeting perspective. This isn't something that's been a big part of financial planning engagements in the past, right? A lot of times when we think about financial planning or financial advice 10, 15 years ago, we were advising clients on investments only. And the investments they had might have been discretionary investments, meaning that they weren't really depending on those investments to provide for their lifestyle, specifically in retirement, maybe because they had a pension or some other form of guaranteed income that was basically going to serve those purposes. And so we didn't talk a lot about budgeting. And it's not even something that we'll talk about with every client in today's financial planning relationships. A lot of our clients will have uh, amounts of accumulated wealth that give them the freedom not to worry about day to day or month to month spending. But a lot of the clients that we work with still see it very valuable for their financial planner to help them with planned spending and really being intentional about how they organize their income and expenditures over the course of a given year. One of the things that's important to note is that when we think about budgeting, it's not about living a constrained life. One of the things that we're going to equip you with as you go through this program is a lot of tools that you can use to be creative to solve client problems. And what I mean by that is we don't want to immediately go to the idea of it's easiest to solve the client's problem if we reduce certain expenses. That may be required in some circumstances, but that's certainly not going to be our first place to look. And so we want to produce solutions that don't reduce the client's lifestyle on the margin. And so let's talk about a few different strategies that we can use. Now, when we look at this budgeting process, one of the things that's probably going to jump right out at you is that this looks a whole lot like the financial planning process, right? We need to establish goals with the client. That's something we do very early in the financial planning process. Then we start to do some analysis, right? How much cash inflows do we have? What are the outflows? Are those outflows necessary or discretionary? Are they fixed or variable? These are things that we can start to look at and have conversations with the client concerning these different issues. Okay. And then we're going to get into analyzing some numbers. What's the client's net worth? Do they have a positive or negative cash surplus at the end of the year? What do their ratios look like? And how can we use cash management to improve their financials, to improve their metrics that we use to measure financial health? And then we're going to come up with some recommendations. We're going to motivate the client to implement those recommendations, and we're going to analyze, track, and adjust as necessary moving forward. So again, the budgeting process is very much like the financial planning process. In a lot of ways, I would say that the budgeting process or the budget in and of itself is the best visual representation of the financial plan. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we continue this conversation. So, what are some successful tips, or what are some tips for preparing a successful budget? So, I think the first thing that we need to recognize is if spending behavior needs to be adjusted, then we need to be realistic on what those adjustments can be. One of the things that the psychology literature shows us is that habits are stronger than intentions, right? And so we have to be really strategic about how we change habits so that they evolve over time to be more aligned with our preferences, and our goals. Another thing that's really helpful is to make sure that there's a line item in the budget for unforeseen expenses. This is definitely a guarantee, right? Right? You hear the common saying, the only thing that's guaranteed is that there are no guarantees. So to assume that we wouldn't have unforeseen expenses might be a little bit naive. And so let's just go ahead and budget for it so that when they do pop up, they don't impact the plan in a negative way. They don't knock us off track. Budgeting takes practice, and we're going to have to educate our clients on what the processes look like, but we're also going to have to encourage our clients to invest the effort and to do so over a period of time until their behavior evolves, again, to be more in line with what's preferred to meet their goals. And then a lot of research says that sharing goals like this with others is helpful in making meaningful progress in an efficient way. So NAPFA, the National Association of Personal Fee-Only Advisors, also took this up on their discussion board to get some tips from advisors on how they work with their clients around budgeting issues. And so some of the things that I thought were interesting that came out of that board were taking baby steps, right? Instead of working towards long-term goals, let's take those long-term goals and let's break them down all the way to small short-term goals. And the reason we like this is because people like the immediate gratification of success, right? So if I can check a box, accomplish a small goal, then human nature tells me to keep going, right? Like you can do this, and we start to build momentum. We start to better understand the benefit of where we're trying to go, and it's more likely that we'll keep pursuing that over the long term as we really work towards the overall objective. Now, a lot of times goals seem big, and the emergency fund is a good example of this. And so instead of worrying about maybe establishing a 3 to 6 month emergency fund right off the bat, NAPFA suggests it says, hey, listen, let's establish a small emergency fund that provides some protection right off the bat, and then let's work towards maybe a more optimal emergency fund. So kind of the same as this whole taking baby steps idea, with the example of using the emergency fund, starting small, working towards the bigger objective, and being content making progress over time, and not necessarily feeling the obligation to fully fund goals in an extremely short term. Another thing that we can do is really make sure we're efficiently managing cash flow. And a good example of this is optimizing payments. So if a client has debts that need to be paid off, optimize payments to clear the highest cost debts first, and then we can free up cash flow, reduce the cost of debt, and be better off in the long term. And then use structured savings plans, right? If we have retirement goals or college education funding goals or something like that, use structured savings plans that have automatic deposits into the appropriate accounts to where you can really establish the goal, set the structure around it, and forget about it, right? Just let the defaults that you've put in place run behind the scenes and take care of funding the objective that we're really trying to pursue. One of the things that we know about human psychology is we're more likely to achieve things if we have to think about it less and input less effort. And so using structured savings plans is a really good way to apply that to savings-based goals. So if we have a client that is really struggling getting a grip on their finances, then we can use something called the bucket strategy. And so the bucket strategy is 3 buckets: a static account, a control account, and a dynamic account. So the static account is an account that represents 30 days of past spending. Okay, so let's say that we're in the month of October, right? And in October, we want to really start spending in a way that's more in line with our planned spending that is included in our budget. Okay, but we know that it's going to be hard to break some of those habits. And so the first thing we'll do is we'll look back to September and say, hey, listen, how does the client spend normally over the last 30 days, right? And so whatever that amount of money was, is we'll set that aside for October. That's not the amount of money we plan on spending in October, but we're saying, hey, listen, if X number of dollars represents past behavior, then let's just go ahead and set it aside in the static account. Okay. And then from that static account, the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to fund the dynamic account. Okay. So in our budget, there should be a line item for every expense that's associated with individual goals. So if saving for college education is a goal, then we should see savings expense, education fund, whatever number of dollars we need to save for education. If saving for retirement is a goal, saving expense, retirement, whatever number of dollars we've determined is optimal to save for retirement. Okay, so we're going to take that and we're going to set that aside and say, we know that out of the money that we have available for this month, that we have already funded all of the cost associated with our goals. That goes into the dynamic account. Okay. So what's left is what's available for consumption over the next 30 or 31 days. Okay. So that's when the control account comes into play. We're going to say, all right, in the control account, we want to pull out 7 days, 1 week's worth of money that represents planned spending, right? It represents the adjustments that we want to make to the spending behavior of the client. And we're going to pull enough money to cover 1 week's worth of consumption. Okay. Now you'll notice that we're not saying, hey, listen, here's the goal for the month. And so let's try to hit the goal for the month. We're doing what NAPFA said. We're taking that month goal for spending and we're breaking it down into weeks. And the reason we do that is because we want to create more immediate success. We've already funded our goals in the dynamic account, success. Control account has 1 week. That's a much shorter period of time. If the client's successful, congratulations, client. You spent according to plan already, right? You can do it. Then let's do it for another days. You did it again, way to go. Let's do it for another 7 days. Now you're really on track. And by the time the month is over, you already have 4 successes. And so this is really, really awesome. Now, if the client slips up and makes a mistake, it's not like they go overdrawn on their account or they don't have the money to cover the mistake or the overspend, right? We can go back to the static account and tell a client like, hey, listen, we're trying to make changes. We understand that this can be challenging. We've got you covered out of your static account, right? We're not hoping to use that, but if we have to, then we can. And then we'll reset and then try to improve in the next 7-day period. So a really effective way of changing behavior quickly by creating a situation where we fund goals and motivate change behavior with a lot of success in a short period of time. Now, when we're thinking about liquid assets and budgeting strategies, now we're really thinking about saving for short-term goals. And this is really important, right? Our short-term goals are oftentimes going to be held in very liquid accounts. But from a budgeting perspective, having an emergency fund to know that we can cover our necessary expenses going forward, even if something happens to our ability to produce income, is really, really helpful. And so an emergency fund is a big time complement to a budget. Okay. So we're going to transition now into saving for goals. Okay. And that's going to be our really big, or not our really big, that's going to be our next cash management topic that we want to look at. And so as we think about that, these are some of the questions that we're going to want to answer as we prepare to save for goals. So we'll be back with another video for Unit 4. Until then, hope you enjoyed.